I've been pretty excited recently when Sirui released the first anamorphic autofocus lens, the 40mm T1.8, which was a total game changer for me. And now, just a few months later, they dropped another one, the Sirui 20mm T1.8 anamorphic autofocus lens here. And this lens actually gives me hope for the future, and by the end of this video, you will know exactly why. But first, let's have a quick look at some shots I got with this lens and figure out together if it's actually any good. The Sirui 20mm T1.8 is surprisingly small and feels really light for what it is, but still quite premium and metallic, just 488 grams. You've got a 77mm filter thread in front, which I wish would either be 82 or 67mm to be more compatible with the filters I use, but 77mm plus step-up ring is certainly doable without making the lens that much thicker on the outer end. It also has an autofocus lock button and an AF/MF switch right on the body, which I don't actually need, but it's always better to have one than not. And it comes with an aperture ring, what I love, which also feels fantastic. It's quite strong with a nice bit of space before you hit auto, so you don't accidentally flick it over. And you can even declick it for smooth exposure pulls if that's important for you. And even when it's declicked, there's still a good amount of resistance towards the automatic aperture setting. So again, you're not gonna accidentally bump into automatic exposure mode. And the focus ring is smooth, but takes a lot of turning to rack focus, so I would just use it for minor adjustments and let the autofocus do the heavy lifting, which is probably why you would get this lens over manual focus anamorphic lenses anyway, so I don't find it to be an actual issue. One thing though, just like with the 40mm, the aperture ring scratches against my fingers sometimes, but it is improved quite a bit compared to the 40mm, which we can also see if we compare them side by side, because Sirui made the aperture ring a bit thinner and also shaved down the edge a bit more, so my finger has more space and it feels less sharp when it touches the edge. So it's not perfect, it's great to see some improvements here, and it's probably as good as it gets so that filmmakers can still attach their gears, and for video creators like me, it's still not too much in the way. I must say I would love if they would also improve it on the 40mm T1.8 like they did on the 20mm here, but I don't see that coming anytime soon, because that's probably something for version 2 of those lenses. Anyway, let's talk about my actual shooting impressions with this lens before we come to the more in-depth tests. I paired it with the Sony a7C Mark II, and size-wise they fit perfectly together, like it doesn't feel front-heavy or so. And I like the size of this lens because it's a bit thicker and therefore relatively short, what makes it great for carrying around and shooting on the go. However, it might sometimes be a little too wide for certain shots on the go, so I found it to be better for static talking headshots. It basically gives you a 30mm vertical and 40mm horizontal field of view in full frame terms, so if you're on an APS-C camera, it could make sense to add a slight 1.2 to 1.3x crop occasionally to get it into the 36 to 40mm full frame equivalent range, what I find a bit nicer for many B-roll shots. But especially for talking headshots, as mentioned, and everything a bit wider, this lens is great. And with full frame cameras, you can actually use clear image zoom with just about a 1.25 to 1.3x crop to achieve a bit wider field of view compared to what you get with the usual 1.5x APS-C crop. You get a bit more vignetting if you do that, but we will come to that later. The autofocus was reliable, like I never felt it was gonna lose me, and it didn't, luckily. The only thing is it takes a second longer to lock onto you compared to other lenses, so I would always give it a second longer to grab focus before you start talking. So much for my experience with this lens, nothing special really, but I do wish that Sony would finally give us anamorphic D-squeeze on our cameras so that I would actually see how it looks later. It would make me more exciting about the footage. Nothing that Sirui can change, that's something that Sony has to solve soon. Anyway, let's come to the image test now, and to mention that from the beginning, beginning, it's an anamorphic lens again, and those lenses are not made to be optically perfect. So take all those tests with a grain of salt. When you buy a lens like that, it's more about the anamorphic characteristics than a perfect image. So first up is our sharpness test. I tested it on the A7C Mark II in APS-C crop mode, and because of that there is some pixelation when you zoom in. It's definitely not the perfect camera to test the lens for sharpness, but I don't have anything else. But even with that, the sharpness is actually quite decent. Even with the pixelation at 400% zoom, you can still clearly see the smallest ring in the test shot. It seems sharpest at around f8 and then drops a bit from f16 onward, which could be a little earlier in my opinion, because many lenses reach the peak sharpness already at a lower aperture. So overall, this is certainly not the sharpest lens I've seen, but for the 4K and up to 6.2K resolutions you would usually use this lens for, center sharpness seems to be good enough. But what I also have to say here is that I noticed there's heavy lateral chromatic aberration across the whole image. That's some of the worst I've seen on a modern lens, because they are not just creeping in at the edges, you already notice them even in the middle of the image and fully zoomed out. And the corners, they are pretty soft wide open. They get better when you stop down to f8, but they never become actually sharp. Honestly though, for anamorphic that's totally fine. You're not framing important stuff in the corners anyway. Plus, if you like a bit of vintage character, you will probably love it. So considering what kind of lens it is, that's actually acceptable. Now we already edged on chromatic aberrations laterally. Let's come to longitudinal chromatic aberrations now, which are pretty strong as well, especially wide open. You see purple fringing and contrasty areas strongly there. By f8 they are mostly gone, but you can still spot them a little bit when you look for them. I wouldn't call it a problem anymore though at this aperture. I also noticed in this test that the contrast is quite low at f1.8, but improves a lot already by f2.8 and stays decent until f16. Talking about vignetting, there is noticeable vignetting wide open and even stopped down. It improves by f5.6, but not dramatically after that, so you will always get a bit of vignetting with this lens. I personally love a good vignette coming from the lens, but here it's also a bit uneven across the frame I found, so it's definitely not my favorite in that case. And yes, I checked it, it was not my lighting setup. More positive is definitely the flaring on this lens. When it comes to the anamorphic lens flares, they are a bit more pronounced as on the 40mm T1.8, which I like because I mentioned in the review of the 40mm that the lens flares could be a bit stronger, and now on the 20mm they are. This lens also shows some regular flares when you point it towards direct light sources, and I actually find them quite pleasing because while they can be pretty big, they are quite transparent, so they don't really distract much from the actual image, but give it a nice pleasing look in my opinion. Of course, that's subjective. Maybe you don't like the look of it, but I personally find it has something. I also noticed that even wide open at f1.8, I could already see sun stars, what surprised me, so I stopped down to f16 to see them even better, and I have to say they look really nice, especially combined with the anamorphic lens flares. I had to set my ISO to 51,200 for this shot in APS-C crop mode, so excuse me for all the noise, but I think it's still a usable image though, at least for documentary purposes. I was quite surprised. And important of course is also the Bokeh. The Bokeh of this lens is quite nice and soft overall, pretty much as I expected, and that also counts for the edges of the Bokeh balls. They are also quite soft, what I like. We're also seeing quite a bit of fringing around the edges of the Bokeh balls, what gives it a nice character, and the balls themselves have a rather egg shape in the center of the frame due to the anamorphic compression, and they become a bit triangular towards the edges. There is also a bit of texture inside the balls, but it's mostly visible when you crop in, so they still look pretty smooth under normal viewing conditions. Nice Bokeh overall. Another positive aspect about this lens is the focus breathing, which is definitely on the lower side while noticeable. I doubt that you would notice the breathing during most focus pulls unless you really pull hard, so that's a good one. And regarding the autofocus, I would say it's good enough for most video creators. Like, I shot a bit longer A-roll outside with it and it didn't lose my face once, but as mentioned in the beginning, it might take a second longer until it focuses on you, so give it a bit of time in the beginning. I also did did a walking test, and there when I walked toward or away from the camera, it did lose me quicker than other lenses would do, and especially when I ran away from the camera, it couldn't keep up at all. So this is certainly not a fast focus lens, but it's also always a question with anamorphic lenses if that's an issue of the lens or the camera, because the camera definitely has a harder time to recognize the subject, especially when it's further away due to the distortion. And I did have the impression that that was the case when I was far away from the camera. So don't use this lens for sports, but for normal stuff, just like moving around while talking, it works flawlessly. So I think that most video creators and solo filmmakers will be perfectly fine with the autofocus. It doesn't randomly hunt around or so. You just have to be aware of the fact that subjects shouldn't move too fast. So let's wrap this up. This is definitely not a perfect lens. There are lots of shortcomings, especially talking about chromatic aberrations, etc. But I do love this lens. It pairs well with the 40mm, giving you a wider option for storytelling and talking headshots. If you're not sure whether to get the 20mm or the 40mm one, I would say if you care more about the anamorphic feel, go with the 40mm, because the longer focal length gives you that shallower depth of field and more pronounced background stretch. So I feel like you see a bit more of that typical anamorphic look on the 40mm. The 20mm still looks great though, just a bit less obvious in terms of anamorphic character, unless looking at lens flares where it's a bit stronger. So if you want to shoot lots of talking head footage, this might be the better lens. The 40mm also does it, but I prefer to be a bit closer to the camera for such shots. And finally, there is still the question in the room why this lens gives me hope, and that's simply because the fact that Sirui brings out a second anamorphic autofocus lens relatively shortly after the initial one tells me that they are serious about it, what gives me hope that we will see more lenses like this in the future. I especially hope for some full frame versions, and of course something even wider like a 20mm full frame equivalent would be great, for example, for things like vlogging. Of course, that would be totally niche, and I would likely be one of the only creators using such a lens for that, but I find it a cool way to differentiate the look of your videos and vlogs. So let's hope that we see similar lenses soon, especially for full frame cameras. But by the way, this lens is also available for Fujifilm to all my Fujifilm lovers here. And I think paired with an X-H2S, this is definitely a good one. And also definitely check out my review of the Sirui 40mm T1.8 Anamorphic autofocus lens next. It's linked right here. And don't forget to subscribe for upcoming videos and tutorials.